So we have another Oberst question here. How useful was the US invasion of the Philippines in 1944? So basically, were the Philippines worth it? Now, very important here for the context. So you have this inter-service rivalry, because you have this everywhere, of the US Army and the US Navy in the Pacific. And basically in 1943 they agreed to a dual advance strategy. So that in the southern area mostly the Army will advance, and in the northern area the Navy will advance. And basically the main protagonist you have here is MacArthur for the US Army and Admiral Nimitz for the Navy. And as many of you probably know, MacArthur is a very controversial general, so it's always a bit difficult to what he really did wrong and not, and what is just because he's controversial. So he was also very important in the Korean War, and then the legacy and everything. So sometimes everything gets mixed up. So also background here. MacArthur was the commander at the Philippines when the Japanese invaded in 1941, and in 1942 he had to leave and he promised to return. So also very important, the Philippines were basically a US colony, so they were not fully independent, they were officially called the Commonwealth, but yeah, so there was some dependence going on, and MacArthur also felt, okay, there's a responsibility we have here. Now to make everything a bit easier, here's a map. So basically here you can see the Philippines with Luzon, the island in the north where the capital Manila is located. And here on the eastern side is the Leyte Island. And up in the north, this island is Formosa, or better known today as Taiwan, which is very important. Now, we now look forward to June 1944. So they had to decide where to go next. Now, Admiral King from the Navy wanted to go for Formosa and also for Xiamen with the Amoy port. Because why? Because they wanted to support the bomber bases in China they had there, and to support them with troops and everything and better logistics. Also, the Joint Chief of Staff were also for Formosa, Taiwan at this point. Now, MacArthur was not particularly happy about this. So, but what were the arguments for going for Formosa, Taiwan? Well, the idea was to defeat the Japanese as fast as possible, and as you can see on the map, Formosa is clearly closer to Japan than the Philippines. Then also closer to China, so for the bomber base and support everything. Now, additionally, skipping the Philippines is basically going the direct route. Now, why the Philippines? Basically, these are MacArthur's arguments. Well, cut off the Japanese communication to the south, so to the East Indies where a lot of the oil was coming in. Then also use it as a base for further advance. For instance, Luzon with the various bases and harbors there. And then, of course, the political aspect, the great national obligation, as he called it, to liberate the Filipinos and also the prisoners of war that were the American prisoners of war that were kept there. Additionally, he argued, if the US wouldn't liberate the Philippines, this would verify the Japanese claims that the US had abandoned the Philippines. And he also argued for the long run prestige in the Far East, and also that the American public would not see well if the Philippines were left alone. Now, of course, counter arguments were, if we finish the war faster, if we go the direct route, the Philippines will be liberated earlier. Clearing the islands is also a major issue, so there's a lot of jungle there, so liberating them will take time. And MacArthur basically, he wants to speak to the guys in Washington. And finally, in July 1944, he gets a conference with Franklin, Drea and Roosevelt. And the conference is more or less inconclusive, because Roosevelt neither goes for fully Formosa nor for fully Philippines. But MacArthur at this point is more cooperative. Now, as time passes by, and now there's several important developments and understanding that happen about Formosa. Now, first off, Formosa was part of the Japanese Empire since 1895, after the First Sino-Japanese War, which I covered in this video. As such, it was rather well and heavily defended. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff noted out they were mutually supporting underground facilities, and they assumed it was as formidable as Kyushu. Now Kyushu is the southern home island of Japan, and I did a video on the defenses of Kyushu there and the chances of invading Operation Olympic. So this doesn't look as an easy target. And one major issue was there were not enough support troops. This was also due to the fact, which is the relation of the European theater of operations and the Pacific theater of operations. The majority of troops were in the European theater of the operations, and it was in 1944 not clear when the war will end, because at certain points they thought the war will be over by Christmas, surprise. And as we all know, this didn't happen. So to a certain degree they said, okay, if we get enough troops from Europe out, if the war is over, then we can do Formosa. But right now we can't. And one idea from the Navy was now, okay, we only take one part of Formosa. And as you can imagine, you have this very well defended island full of Japanese, and then you just take one part to operate. Yeah, it is a bad idea. And also B-29 bombers from Formosa could barely reach Japan, so it was also not a proper basis. Now, the Japanese also started their offensive against the bomber bases in China, and they basically overran most of the Chinese defenses and everything. So getting Formosa to support the Chinese bomber bases was now not an option anymore. Now, another very important aspect that happened, the fast carrier forces entered the Philippine area, and basically they reported the Philippines are wide open. The Admiral reported, and so they went, okay, we recommend an early invasion. Let's move the whole schedule up 2 months. So this meant, since Formosa was a way tougher nut to crack, nearly everyone except Admiral King was, okay, let's go for the Philippines. Especially since now it was clear, okay, the European theater of operation is not going to end. We don't have enough support troops and everything for Formosa. We need to go for the Philippines. And also there are ports and bases in Luzon, in the northern parts of the Philippines, that should help for the invasion of Japan. So everyone was basically, besides Admiral King, was also, okay, let's go now for the Philippines. So how did it go? Well, as you can imagine, the plan of MacArthur was way too optimistic. So his units got bogged down, slowly advanced. Now very important, there was the naval battle of the Leyte Gulf. So, and the Imperial Japanese Navy lost a majority of ships there. One of the greatest losses in the war. There was 1 carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Now, a very decisive result. Yet the problem is, the US didn't have complete control of the seas, even due to that, because they had now a major lack of air power. This was due to the wearing down of the US carriers, and especially the escort carriers that happened in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. And also the airfield construction didn't went well, so the US Army Air Force couldn't provide proper air cover. And there was also some problems between the Navy and the Air Force, because also kamikaze attacks started now. So, because the Philippines were of course supplied with planes from Formosa, from Taiwan. They had a lot of planes there. Now another effect was that the invasion of Leyte, originally the Japanese army wanted to fight on Luzon because it was way better established there. But since the Imperial Japanese Navy completely overreported their success in the battle of the Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese army decided to fight the decisive battle on Leyte. And they shipped in more reinforcements and everything else, and this likely made the victory in the long run for the US troops easier, because they were not fighting on ideal Japanese ground. Also, as mentioned, Japanese switched to kamikaze tactics at this point, and they inflicted various losses on the US Navy. Now, they didn't sink any major carriers, but the operational number from 17 carriers went down to 12, because some had to be shipped to the west coast for repairs. Additionally, there was a mishap that one admiral moved the whole task force into a typhoon, and they lost 3 destroyers and 146 aircraft, which again was a major problem for the air cover, and the Japanese could still ship in various reinforcements over the sea, although basically the Japanese Navy was gone. Now, how was the situation on the ground, the Battle of the Philippines? It also wasn't developing rather well. So Manila, the capital, was held till March 1945. Now, this is a bit complicated subject here. Manila was the capital that was most destroyed from the Allies besides Warsaw. As you can imagine, it was a very, very bad situation. And the Japanese naval infantry decided to hold Manila because actually the Imperial Japanese army ordered it an open city and retreat out of there, but they didn't have, so it was kind of a mishap. And as you can imagine, since it was so majorly destroyed, there was a large amount of civilian losses. And the Philippines held out certain parts of it till the end of the war. So it was never fully liberated till the Japanese surrendered. Additional US division was shrunk and exhausted, so for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, this would also have a problem. In other words, there were very little benefits in taking the Philippines. The ports of Luzon were good for an invasion of Japan, but you also need to look at the dual advance strategy. So this was grown out of inter-service rivalry, but it also had a benefit. Basically, it prevented, since there were usually always two offensives going on, it prevented the Japanese to focus on against a single US offensive. And another aspect was it confused the hell out of the Japanese, because sometimes they were shipping divisions and everything around because they couldn't understand what the US were doing. So sometimes divisions were sent there where they weren't needed and the other way around. Of course, another aspect that happened, the East Indies were cut off, so there was no more oil coming in. But to a certain degree, this was already well done by the US submarine force because, they destroyed the Japanese merchant navy. And especially the attack or the liberation of the southern islands of the Philippines were, most people agree, a complete waste of time and troops. Yet, it's very important here to not become a hindsight warrior. Because we know a lot now. We know how the war developed. We know they took Iwo Jima, they took Okinawa, and then they tried to stage an invasion there. If you look at the situation in 1944, there's basically the discussion between do we go for the Philippines or do we go for Formosa, Taiwan? The others are not really on the table. Because there was one aspect where they consider, okay, let's go directly for surprise attack for Japan or Okinawa. But this was just some Washington planners and they say, okay, no, this is too dangerous, this is too problematic. And originally, of course, only MacArthur wanted the Philippines. And he could argue, okay, this was for political reasons and everything, and his ego, yeah, that's right. But in the end, nearly everyone except King agreed. And there were good points for it because Formosa was even worse. So if you look at Formosa, it likely would have turned out into a bigger Okinawa because it was well more supplied and also way larger. So what do you want to have to do there? Additionally, the battle in the Leyte Gulf and the other aspects, this wore the Japanese Navy and also the Japanese Air Forces down. So if you hadn't the battle, the various air battles and kamikaze attacks there, you would likely have way more on Okinawa. And Okinawa didn't lack kamikaze planes. By the way, I did a video on kamikazes, so to get a better understanding on that. So you can argue the Philippines was not really worth it, but the issue is, was there a real alternative without being a hindsight warrior and knowing how everything turned out? This is the main issue, and so I say, okay, taking the Philippines, I think it would have made more sense to say, okay, we just take Luzon and Leyte, and definitely keep out the southern islands and some other aspects, and try to mitigate the losses in several other aspects and don't get bogged down. So, in general, I would say, okay, Philippines was not necessarily the wrong decision, but how it was conducted. But again, this also is a lot from hindsight. So in hindsight, was it worth it? No. But was the real alternative going for Formosa? Doesn't seem like a really suitable option from everything I read so far. And also I discussed this quite extensively with Justin, who is more of an expert in the Pacific theater of operations, and we basically came to the same conclusion. So big thank you here. Well, first for Justin for the long discussion we had on the whole issue. Then for Jack for sending me Implacable Foes. For Peter and Anna for sending me the Imperial Japanese Army. And for Jack again for the question. I hope you learned something new. Thank you for watching and see you next time.